There's a specific kind of person almost everyone has met. Brilliant on paper, top of the class, technically gifted at their job, and somehow constantly at war with coworkers, blindsided by their own outbursts, mystified by why promotions keep going to people who seem, on paper, less qualified than they are. Meanwhile, there's another kind of person, often less impressive by every traditional measure. Average grades, unremarkable resume, who somehow ends up leading the team, calming the room during a crisis, and getting promoted again and again, while people wonder what exactly they're doing right. Think about which of these two people you've actually wanted to work for, follow, or trust with something important. Rarely is it the one with the higher test scores. Almost always, it's the one who somehow makes you feel heard, stays calm when things go wrong, and reads a room before anyone has said a word out loud.
Daniel Goleman spent years researching this exact gap, and his answer overturned decades of assumptions about what actually predicts success in life. It wasn't IQ. According to the research he compiled, IQ explains a surprisingly small portion of what separates high achievers from everyone else. The much larger factor, largely ignored by schools, hiring managers, and most of us evaluating our own potential, was something else entirely: emotional intelligence. And here's the question this book forces you to confront. If this matters as much,
most of us were raised inside a school system built almost entirely around a single kind of intelligence, the kind measured by tests, grades, and standardized scores. Vocabulary, math ability, logical reasoning. If you scored well on these, you were labeled smart. If you didn't, the label quietly shifted, no matter what other capabilities you actually had. Goleman's research draws on decades of longitudinal studies, tracking people well into their careers, and the finding is consistently uncomfortable for anyone who built their identity around academic performance. IQ correlates only modestly with real-world success, professional advancement, and even personal happiness. Something else was doing far more of the actual work. A person's ability to recognize their own emotions, manage their reactions under pressure, read the emotional states of others accurately, and navigate relationships skillfully. This creates a real problem for a huge number of capable people. If you were praised your whole life primarily for your intellectual output, and nobody ever named or trained the emotional side of the equation, you can arrive in adulthood highly credentialed and genuinely unprepared for the actual skill set that determines whether people trust you, follow you, and want to work with you. This is the real problem this book solves. Not how do I get smarter, but why does raw intelligence so often fail to translate into the success, relationships, and leadership people expect it to produce? And what's actually missing from the equation? If you've ever watched someone less qualified on paper outperform you socially or professionally, that wasn't unfair. According to this research, they were simply better at a skill nobody ever told you was being measured at all.
Goleman builds his entire framework around a specific structural fact about the brain, and understanding it reframes almost every emotional reaction you'll ever have. The amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure buried deep in the brain, processes emotional information faster than the neocortex, the region responsible for rational thought and reasoning. This isn't a design flaw. It's an ancient survival mechanism. When a genuine physical threat appeared, waiting for slow, deliberate reasoning to catch up could get you killed. So emotional reaction evolved to fire first, ask questions later. The problem is that this same lightning-fast circuitry fires just as intensely over a snide email, a perceived insult in a meeting, or a partner's offhand comment. Situations with zero actual physical danger, where the reflexive reaction is almost always disproportionate to the real stakes. Goleman calls this an amygdala hijack, and it explains an enormous amount of behavior people later regret. The outburst you can't take back, the decision made in fury that you'd never have made calmly, the relationship damaged by a 5-second reaction that took 5 years to repair. Here's the piece most people never learn. There's a documented window, typically just a few seconds, between an emotional trigger firing and the neocortex catching up with rational context. Emotional intelligence, at its most practical level, is largely the skill of recognizing that window while it's happening and deliberately creating enough space inside it to choose a response, instead of simply reacting. Goleman identifies self-awareness as the foundational skill everything else in the framework depends on, and it's more subtle than it initially sounds. It's not simply knowing you're upset. It's noticing the emotion as it's forming, in real time, before it has fully hijacked your behavior. Most people, according to Goleman's research, operate with what he calls emotional flooding as their default mode during conflict, fully immersed in a feeling without any observing distance from it, making it functionally impossible to think clearly while it's happening. A smaller group operates with genuine self-awareness, maintaining a kind of internal narrator that notices, I'm becoming defensive right now, even while the defensiveness is actively rising. This distinction matters enormously in practice. The flooded person experiences their anger as simply the truth of the situation. The other person really is being unreasonable. The criticism really was unfair. The self-aware person experiences the same initial emotional surge, but holds a second simultaneous awareness that the intensity of the reaction may not perfectly match the actual stakes of the situation, creating room to check that assumption before acting on it. The book's practical guidance here is almost deceptively simple. Build the habit of naming the emotion internally, specifically, and immediately the moment you notice it rising. Not I'm fine or vague discomfort, but a precise label: frustration, embarrassment, jealousy. Goleman cites research showing that the simple act of accurately naming an emotion measurably reduces its intensity, engaging the rational brain just enough to interrupt the amygdala's full takeover. The book's second major pillar is emotional regulation. Not suppression, which Goleman is careful to distinguish clearly, but the ability to experience a strong emotion without being fully controlled by it. Suppression, the research shows, tends to backfire. Emotions pushed down rather than processed don't disappear. They tend to resurface later, often more intensely, or leak out sideways in unrelated situations, snapping at a family member over something trivial after a suppressed bad day at work. Regulation is different. It's feeling the full emotion honestly, while still maintaining enough command over behavior to choose a constructive response, rather than an automatic one. Goleman highlights a specific technique with strong research backing: a deliberate pause, as short as 6 seconds, before responding to a triggering situation. This isn't about denying the emotion any space. It's about giving the neocortex just enough time to weigh in before the amygdala's reaction gets translated directly into words or action. 6 seconds sounds almost trivially small, and that's precisely the point. It's short enough to be genuinely practical in the heat of a real conflict, while still being long enough to interrupt the automatic hijack. This connects to a broader finding the book returns to repeatedly. People who regulate emotion well aren't people who feel less. Often they feel just as intensely as anyone else. The difference is entirely in the gap they've trained between the feeling and the action that follows it. Goleman leans heavily on a famous piece of research to make the case for why this particular skill matters so much over the long run: the Stanford marshmallow experiments, where young children were offered 1 marshmallow immediately, or 2 if they could wait alone in a room for several minutes without eating the first one. What made this study so influential wasn't the marshmallow itself, it was the follow-up. Researchers tracked these same children years later, into adolescence and beyond, and found that the ability to delay gratification at 4 or 5 years old correlated strongly with better academic performance, stronger relationships, and greater career success decades afterward, a far stronger correlation than early IQ scores produced. Goleman uses this to argue that the capacity to manage an immediate emotional impulse, the urge to eat the marshmallow, the urge to fire off an angry reply, the urge to quit the moment something gets hard, is one of the earliest visible signs of the exact skill set the rest of the book is built around. The children who waited weren't smarter. They had, even at that young age, already begun developing the internal mechanism for noticing an impulse and choosing not to act on it immediately. Goleman's third pillar moves outward from the self entirely. Empathy, defined here with more precision than the word usually gets in casual conversation, not simply feeling sorry for someone, but the accurate ability to read another person's emotional state, even when it isn't being explicitly stated. The book distinguishes between several distinct layers of this skill. Cognitive empathy, the ability to understand intellectually what someone else might be feeling and why. Emotional empathy, actually feeling a resonant version of what the other person feels. And empathic concern, the motivation to actually act on that understanding to help. Goleman argues that many people are strong in one dimension and weak in another, and mismatches here cause real relational damage. Someone high in cognitive empathy but low in empathic concern can read a room perfectly and still manipulate what they see for personal advantage, a pattern the book links to certain kinds of skilled but ultimately exploitative leaders. Someone high in emotional empathy but low in regulation can become so absorbed in others' distress that they burn out trying to help everyone, unable to maintain the boundaries needed to be useful long term. The practical skill Goleman emphasizes here is active listening in its fullest sense, attending not just to a person's words, but to tone, posture, and what's being carefully avoided, treating the unspoken signal as often more informative than the stated one. The final pillar, social skill, is where all the previous pieces combine into something visible to other people. The ability to build rapport, manage conflict, influence, and lead, built entirely on the foundation of the earlier skills, rather than existing independently of them. Goleman is direct about a common misconception here. Social skill isn't the same as extroversion or charisma. Plenty of naturally outgoing, charming people have relatively low emotional intelligence, using their social ease to dominate rooms rather than genuinely read them. And plenty of quieter, more introverted people demonstrate extremely high social skill in this specific sense, reading a tense meeting accurately, choosing exactly the right moment to speak, diffusing conflict before it escalates, all without needing to be the loudest voice in the room. This is why emotionally intelligent leadership so often looks unremarkable from the outside, and why the book's opening puzzle makes sense once you understand the full framework. The person who ends up leading the team isn't necessarily the most impressive on paper. They're the one whose self-awareness, regulation, empathy, and social skill compound together into a level of trust and calm influence that raw intellectual horsepower alone simply cannot produce. Here's the deeper message underneath everything in this book. We've built entire systems, schools, hiring processes, our own sense of self-worth around a narrow definition of intelligence that predicts far less about real-world success than most of us were ever told. And because emotional intelligence was never formally taught the way math or reading was, an enormous number of genuinely capable people move through life never developing the specific skills that would have made the biggest difference in how their intelligence actually translated into results. So the uncomfortable truth is this. If you've ever felt mystified by why competence alone hasn't produced the trust, leadership, or relationships you expected it to, the missing piece was probably never more competence. It was the quieter, trainable skill of recognizing your own emotional reactions in real time and choosing your response, rather than defaulting to it. The real question isn't, am I smart enough? It's, the next time I feel that familiar surge before I react, can I catch it in the 6 seconds before it catches me? That's the entire argument of this book. Not a fixed trait you either have or don't. A skill, learnable at any age, built one caught reaction at a time. The most capable people in any room are rarely the ones who feel the least. They're simply the ones who've trained the gap between feeling and reacting long enough that it's become second nature. No test score is going to hand you this skill automatically. According to decades of research this book compiles,
It has to be built deliberately, one noticed emotion at a time. The question now isn't whether you're naturally gifted at reading people. It's whether you're willing to catch your very next amygdala hijack in real time, starting today.
If this changed how you think about intelligence, subscribe for more breakdowns like this one. And drop a comment with the last time a 6-second pause would have saved you from a reaction you regretted. And if you want to see how this connects to building the kind of discipline that makes emotional regulation actually stick, watch the video on screen now. It picks up exactly where this one leaves off.